You already know this story. Almost everybody does. God puts the first man into a deep sleep, opens him up, takes out one of his ribs, and builds a woman from the bone. It has been painted onto cathedral ceilings, carved into stone above church doors, and repeated in more sermons than anyone could ever count. It is probably the most famous surgical procedure in all of literature. At least, that is what everyone thought was written there. Because the Hebrew word sitting inside that verse shows up more than 40 times across the Hebrew Bible, and in every single other place it appears, no translator on earth renders it as rib. Not once, and not anywhere else. More than 40 appearances, one consistent meaning, and then one lone verse in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, where the meaning quietly changes into something else. This story does not begin in a garden. It begins with a single word, with the 40 other places that word turns up, and with a decision made by a Latin scholar sitting in a stone cell in Bethlehem around the year 405, a decision that ended up shaping how well over 1 billion people picture the origin of women. The word is Tsela. If you want to know what Tsela actually means, you do not need a seminary degree or a lexicon. You just need to read the other places it appears, because the Bible defines its own vocabulary better than any dictionary can. Open the book of Exodus, chapter 25. God is giving Moses the blueprints for the Ark of the Covenant. Cast 4 rings of gold for it, the text says, and put them on its 4 feet, 2 rings on the one Tsela of it, and 2 rings on the other Tsela of it. The ark is a wooden chest. It does not have ribs. It has sides. Keep reading. Chapter 26, the instructions for the tabernacle itself. For the 2nd Tsela of the tabernacle, on the north side, 20 boards. Chapter 27, the bronze altar. The poles shall be put into the rings, and the poles shall be on the 2 selaot of the altar. Chapter 30, the altar of incense. 2 golden rings on the 2 selaot of it. Every one of these is a flat plane of a structure. Every one of them is a side. And we are still inside one book. The word keeps going. Now jump forward several centuries to the 1st book of Kings, chapter 6, where Solomon is building the temple in Jerusalem. Against the wall of the house he built selaot round about, and the text goes on to describe them as small chambers, stacked in 3 levels against the outside of the sanctuary. Translators render those as side chambers, because that is exactly what they are. Rooms built onto the flank of a building. Ezekiel does the same thing. In his enormous visionary temple in chapter 41, the word appears over and over, and again it means the side chambers ringing the main structure. 30 of them, the prophet counts, in 3 tiers. That is 4 separate biblical authors, writing centuries apart, reaching for the same word and meaning the same thing by it. And the 5th occurrence is my favorite, because it settles the question completely, and it has nothing to do with architecture at all. 2 Samuel chapter 16. King David is fleeing Jerusalem during his own son's rebellion, walking a road in the valley, and a man named Shimei is following along above him, cursing him and throwing stones. The text says, Shimei went along on the Tsela of the hill. The hillside, the flank of the slope, a geographical feature, and nothing more. So here is what the evidence actually looks like. Sides of a box, sides of a tent, sides of an altar, side rooms of a temple, the side of a hill. That is the semantic range. That is what the word does across the entire Hebrew Bible. And then Genesis 2, verse 21, where the exact same word suddenly becomes a bone in a man's chest. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a lot of channels overplay their hand. Nobody here is claiming that rib is impossible. What I am claiming is that rib is a translation choice, one option among several, and that it is the only place in the entire Bible where anyone chooses it. Every other time the word appears, the translators reach for the architectural meaning without hesitating. Something about this one verse made them reach somewhere else, and the reason is not linguistic. We will get to what the reason actually was, and it involves a specific man, a specific year, and a specific language. But before that, there is a second word in the verse, and honestly, it might be the bigger clue. Here is what Genesis 2, verse 22 says in Hebrew. And the Lord God banah the Tsela, which he had taken from the man, into a woman. Bana. It means to build, not to form, not to shape, not to create, not to fashion. To build, the way you build a house, the way you build a city wall, the way Solomon builds the temple. It is a construction verb. It is used hundreds of times across the Hebrew Bible, and it almost always involves architecture. Now compare that with what happens 14 verses earlier, when the man himself is made. Genesis 2, verse 7. The Lord God Yatsar, the man from the dust of the ground. Yatsar is a completely different verb. It is what a potter does with wet clay. It is the language of molding, of squeezing something soft into shape with your hands. Isaiah uses it constantly for the potter and the clay. So the man is molded like pottery. The woman is built like a structure. Two different verbs, deliberately chosen, sitting 14 verses apart in the same chapter by the same author. I mean, think about that for a second. The text has just handed us a construction verb applied to a word that means the side of a building, and for 1600 years the standard reading has been that this is a description of bone surgery. And here is the detail that almost everyone missed. Ancient Jewish readers noticed the building verb, and they did something with it that English translations cannot reproduce. And here is what they did with it. In Hebrew, bana, to build, sounds almost identical to bina, which means understanding or discernment or insight. The rabbis of the Talmud picked up on that echo directly. In Tractate Niddah, folio 45, there is a discussion that reads the building of the woman as an act of endowing her with bina, greater discernment than the man. Whether you find that reading persuasive or not, notice what it tells you. The people who spoke this language natively read verse 22 as architecture and wordplay, not as a report from an operating room. If the story had stopped there, this would be a very different video, a curious translation choice, a nice piece of trivia, something you bring up at a dinner party and then forget. But the word Tsela is only the first crack. Once you start pulling at it, the entire second chapter of Genesis starts to look different, and so does the first chapter. And so does a verse in chapter 5 that most people skip straight past. Because the Bible actually contains two accounts of the creation of humanity, they do not obviously agree with each other, and the oldest Jewish interpreters in the world had a startling explanation for why. That explanation is more than 1,500 years old. It is preserved in the Talmud and in the classical Midrash. It was defended by the single most influential Bible commentator in Jewish history, and if you have ever read Plato, you are going to recognize it immediately, which raises a question about who borrowed what from whom. There is also one more place this exact word appears, translated into Greek, in a scene that almost every Christian on earth knows by heart. Nobody ever connects the two verses, because in English the connection has been erased. In the original languages it is impossible to miss. We will get there. And there is a second mistranslation sitting 2 verses earlier, one that produced an English word which does not exist in the Hebrew at all, and which you have almost certainly heard somebody use about a wife. That one did more damage than the rib did. First, though, we need to talk about the 2 creation stories, and about the fact that in the Hebrew text, the word Adam is not a name. There are 2 creation accounts in Genesis, and they do not tell the same story. The first one runs through chapter 1 and stops in the 3rd verse of chapter 2. It is orderly, liturgical, almost hymn-like, with light and sky and land and creatures arriving in a fixed sequence, each day closing with the same refrain. Humanity shows up on day 6, right at the end, as the finale. The second one starts halfway through chapter 2 and runs into chapter 3. It has a completely different flavor. The order is reversed. The man arrives before the plants and the animals. The tone shifts from cosmic to intimate, and God is suddenly hands-on, digging in soil, planting a garden, walking around in the cool of the evening. Scholars have written entire libraries about why these two accounts sit side by side. That is not the road we are going down. What matters for us is one specific sentence in the first account, because it creates a problem that the second account then has to solve. Genesis chapter 1 verse 27. So God created Adam in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Read that again slowly, because the grammar does something strange. Him, singular. Them, plural. In the space of a single verse, one being becomes two, and the text does not explain how. And it happens again in chapter 5, in a verse almost nobody quotes, Genesis 5 verse 2. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them, and called their name Adam, in the day when they were created. Their name. Singular name, plural people, two human beings sharing one designation between them. And that is not a scribal slip. It happens twice in 2 different chapters, preserved by scribes meticulous enough to count the individual letters of the text, so that none of them could drift. They knew exactly what they were copying. This is where the second Hebrew fact becomes important, and it is one that English translation buries almost completely. In these chapters, Adam is not a personal name. The Hebrew reads Ha-Adam with the definite article attached, and Hebrew does not put the definite article on proper nouns. You cannot say the David or the Sarah, so Ha-Adam is a description rather than a name. The human, the earthling, the groundling, if you want to be blunt about it, because the word is built directly out of Adamah, which means soil, and the pun is deliberate. God forms the Adam out of the Adamah. It is the same joke as forming a human out of humus, and it survives in English only by accident. So the being in the garden for the first 2 chapters is simply a human, made of dirt, with no name and no stated gender. Which brings us to the moment everything changes, and this is the detail that makes the whole argument. Look at what happens the instant that Tsela is separated. Genesis 2 verse 23, and this is the human's first recorded speech. This one shall be called Isha, because out of Ish this one was taken. Ish and Isha, man and woman. Those 2 words have not appeared anywhere in the story before this line, not once. Up to this point the text has said Ha-Adam, the human, roughly 20 times without ever reaching for a gendered term. Then the separation happens, and both gendered words arrive in the very same sentence, at the very same moment, side by side. The being does not become a man because something was removed from him. He becomes a man because she now exists. Before the split there is no ish in the text, because there is nothing for him to be distinguished from. Now you can read that as a literary flourish. Plenty of careful scholars do, and it is a perfectly defensible position. But the oldest Jewish interpreters in the world did not read it as a flourish. They read it as a description of what physically happened, and their explanation is one of the strangest things preserved in classical rabbinic literature. It is called du parzufim, which means 2 faces, or double-faced. And I should warn you that the version in the original sources is a great deal blunter than anything you will hear from a pulpit. The clearest version sits in Genesis Rabbah, a collection of interpretive traditions compiled in the land of Israel in roughly the 5th century, though the material inside it is considerably older. In the 8th section, Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar makes the claim directly. When the Holy One created the first Adam, he created it du partsufim, and then he sawed it apart and made it 2 backs, one back on this side and one back on that side. The same tradition appears in the Talmud in at least 2 separate places, in Tractate Berakot on folio 61 and in Tractate Eruvin on folio 18, where the sages debate the precise mechanics of it. And the verb they reach for is the one used for sawing a thing lengthwise, the way a carpenter splits a beam down its length. Nothing surgical about it. Under this reading, Genesis 2 verse 21 is not describing extraction, it is describing division. God did not remove a component from a finished man. God took one side of an unfinished, undivided human and separated it into a second complete person. One of his Tsela means one of his 2 sides. And once you accept that framing, 3 problems in the text dissolve at once. The him and them of chapter 1 stops being a contradiction. The single shared name in chapter 5 stops being odd. The sudden simultaneous arrival of Ish and Isha in chapter 2 makes perfect sense. The building verb makes sense too, because you build a structure out of a side. Now, I want to be honest about something, because a lot of channels covering this material quietly skip it. This is not some fringe medieval invention. Rashi, the 11th century French commentator whose notes are printed alongside the Hebrew text in basically every traditional edition on earth, and who is arguably the most influential Bible commentator in Jewish history, addresses this verse head-on. On Genesis 2:21, he glosses the word as from his sides, and he cross-references it directly to the tabernacle passage in Exodus 26. On chapter 1, he cites the 2-faced tradition without embarrassment. So the reading you are hearing is not a modern reinterpretation invented by someone with a point to prove. It is roughly 2,000 years old. It is preserved in the central texts of Rabbinic Judaism, and the most mainstream commentator in that entire tradition thought it was worth putting on the page. But the version you have heard is not the full picture, because there is a complication, and I would rather hand it to you than have you find it in the comments. If you have read Plato, you already know where this is going. In the Symposium, written somewhere around the 380s before Christ, Plato has the comic playwright Aristophanes deliver a speech about the origin of love. Human beings, he says, were originally round creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces looking in opposite directions. They grew arrogant, so Zeus cut them in half to weaken them. Ever since, each half has wandered the world searching for its missing other half, and that search, that ache for the piece that completes you, is what we call love. 2 faces, a being cut in half, and halves that spend their lives seeking reunion. All of it sitting alongside a Hebrew text that ends the same scene with the line about a man leaving his father and mother, clinging to his wife, and the 2 of them becoming one flesh. So which came first? The Genesis text is far older than Plato, but Genesis Rabbah, where the 2-faced tradition is written down most explicitly, was compiled roughly 800 years after the Symposium in a Mediterranean world thoroughly soaked in Greek philosophy. Some scholars argue the rabbis were reading Genesis through a Hellenistic lens. Others argue the tradition was already circulating in Jewish circles, and the Greek version is a parallel, not a parent. There is genuinely no way to settle it, and anyone who tells you the answer is obvious is selling something. What I will say is this. The Hebrew text itself, sitting there in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 5, has the split-being pattern baked into its grammar, with no Greek assistance required. The pronouns do the work all on their own. And hold on to that phrase, one flesh, because it comes back at the very end of this video in a place you would never expect. In a single Greek word that ties this garden scene to a Roman execution, which leaves us with the piece of the verse we have not touched yet. If this was a division rather than an extraction, then what exactly was the deep sleep for? Because that word has a history too, and in every other place it appears in the Hebrew Bible, it does not mean unconsciousness at all. Before we get to the sleep, there is a scene most readers skim straight past, and it only makes sense under one of the two readings. Between the statement that the human should not be alone and the moment the sleep falls, something odd happens. God parades every animal past him. The text says, God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the human to see what he would call them. So he names them all, one by one, and then the narrator delivers the punchline. But for the human there was not found an ezer kenegdo. Read as a straightforward story, that is strange. God has just announced a problem and stated the solution, and then apparently tries to solve it with livestock. Commentators have tied themselves in knots over this for centuries. But look at the Hebrew in verse 18 one more time. It is not good for the human to be levado. English gives us alone, which is fine, but the word underneath it is built on the root bad, which carries the sense of a part, a portion, something separated out. Levado is closer to in his separateness, in his by himselfness, the condition of being one piece where there should be two. And now the animal parade reads as exactly what it is, a search. The human is looking through every living thing that exists, checking each one and finding nothing that corresponds to him. Not because animals are inferior, but because the counterpart he is looking for is not out there in the field at all. It is already inside him, undivided, and it cannot be found by looking outward, because it has to be separated out. That is why the parade comes first and the sleep comes second. The search has to fail before the division can happen, or the human would never understand what he was being given. He has to exhaust the entire created order, name every creature on earth, and come up empty, so that when he finally opens his eyes and sees her, he can say the thing he says. Which brings us finally to the sleep itself. The Hebrew word is Tardemah, and English Bibles almost always render it as a deep sleep. Which is not wrong exactly, it just leaves out everything that makes the word interesting. Because Tardemah is rare. It appears only a handful of times in the entire Hebrew Bible, and when you line up those occurrences, a pattern jumps out immediately. Genesis 15, verse 12. Abraham has been told to cut animals in half and lay the pieces opposite each other. As the sun goes down, a Tardemah falls on him, and a dread of great darkness comes over him. And then, while he is in that state, God speaks to him and shows him the next 400 years of his descendants' history. That is not a nap. That is a vision. 1 Samuel 26. David sneaks into Saul's camp at night and walks straight past the sleeping soldiers because a Tardemah from the Lord has fallen on all of them. Supernatural, imposed from outside, serving a purpose. Job, twice. Chapter 4, verse 13, and chapter 33, verse 15. Both times the word sits inside a description of visions of the night, when Tardemah falls upon men, and God opens their ears and terrifies them with warnings. Isaiah 29, verse 10. The Lord has poured out on you a spirit of Tardemah, and has closed your eyes, the prophets, used there as a metaphor for prophetic blindness, which only works as a metaphor because the word is already associated with prophecy. And Daniel, twice in chapters 8 and 10, using the same root, both times describing what happens to him when an angelic figure appears and he collapses face down and receives a revelation. Pay attention to this next part because it explains a great deal. When Jewish translators in Alexandria produced the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, roughly 250 years before Christ, they had to pick a Greek word for Tardemah in Genesis 2. They did not choose a word for sleep. They chose ekstasis, ekstasis. It is where we get the English word ecstasy, and in Greek it means standing outside yourself. A trance, a state of displaced consciousness in which you perceive things you would not otherwise perceive. It is the same word Luke later uses in the book of Acts for the trance Peter falls into on the rooftop before the vision of the sheet. And here is the detail almost nobody hears. Those same translators used ekstasis again for Abraham's Tardemah in Genesis 15. They saw the two scenes as the same category of event. So the oldest translation of Genesis in existence, produced by native readers of Hebrew who lived closer to the composition of the text than we lived to the invention of the printing press, did not think the human was anesthetized for an operation. They thought he was put into a visionary trance, which changes what the scene is about. If the sleep is anesthesia, the human is a patient. He is unconscious cargo, and the story is about something being done to him. If the sleep is ekstasis, he is a witness. He is being shown the separation as it happens, and everything he says afterward is the report of somebody who saw it. And that reframes his first words completely, because there is a phrase in verse 23 that English translations tend to smooth over. The Hebrew opens with zot hapam, which is usually rendered as this is now or this at last. It carries a sense of recognition and release, a person finally seeing the thing they have been waiting for, not a man waking up confused and being introduced to a stranger. A man who has just watched something happen and is naming what he saw. Then comes the line everyone knows. This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And this is where I think the rib reading does the most damage, because it turns a covenant oath into a medical statement. That phrase is not unique to Genesis 2. It is a fixed formula, and it appears 4 more times in the Hebrew Bible, always in situations that have nothing whatsoever to do with anatomy. Genesis 29 verse 14. Jacob arrives at his uncle Laban's house after fleeing his brother, and Laban embraces him and says, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." Judges 9 verse 2. Abimelech is campaigning to be made ruler over the city of Shechem, and he sends a message to the men of the city, reminding them, "Remember that I am your bone and your flesh." That is 2. The next 2 are the ones that make the pattern impossible to argue with, because both of them happen while somebody is being made king. 2 Samuel 5 verse 1. All the tribes of Israel come to David at Hebron to make him king, and their opening words are, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh." And again in 2 Samuel 19, when David is trying to win back the loyalty of the elders of Judah after a rebellion, and he sends word asking why they are the last to bring the king home, since they are his bone and his flesh. Notice what all 4 of those have in common. None of them involves surgery, and none of them involves a body part being physically shared. Every single one is a declaration of kinship and binding obligation, spoken at a moment where an alliance is being formed or repaired. Laban is claiming family rights over Jacob. Abimelech is claiming political loyalty. The tribes are swearing allegiance to a king. David is calling in a debt of solidarity. The biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann laid this out in a paper back in 1970, arguing that the phrase functions as a covenant formula, and that in Genesis 2 it is doing exactly the same work it does everywhere else. It is not reporting where the woman came from. It is a man standing in front of another person and swearing, in the strongest language his culture has, that they belong to each other and always will. And no, I am not making that up. You can go look at those 4 passages yourself and see the identical wording. So read the verse again with that in mind. He is saying, "This one is mine, and I am hers. We are of one substance. This is a bond that cannot be dissolved." Which is precisely why the passage ends the way it does, with the line about a man leaving his father and mother and clinging to his wife, and the two of them becoming one flesh again. You cannot become one flesh again unless you were one flesh to begin with. The reunion only makes sense if there was a separation. By the 3rd century before Christ, everything I have just described was still intact. The Hebrew text still said side. The oldest Greek translation still used a word that could mean side. Jewish interpreters were still reading a division rather than an extraction. The ambiguity was alive, and both readings sat comfortably next to each other for centuries. And then Latin happened. Around the year 382, a scholar named Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus, who history remembers as Jerome, was commissioned to clean up the mess that Latin scripture had become. There were dozens of competing Latin versions circulating in the Roman world, most of them translated from Greek, most of them disagreeing with each other. Jerome was asked to produce one authoritative text. He eventually moved to Bethlehem, set himself up near the traditional site of the Nativity, and did something almost nobody in the Western Church was doing at the time. He learned Hebrew. He hired Jewish tutors. He argued loudly and repeatedly that the Old Testament should be translated from the original Hebrew rather than from the Greek, and he had a slogan for it, Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth. So when Jerome reached Genesis chapter 2, he was not guessing. He was reading Tsela in Hebrew, with a Jewish teacher available to consult, and he knew perfectly well what that word did everywhere else in the text, because he translated all those other passages too. He rendered the sides of the ark. He rendered the side chambers of Solomon's temple. He knew, and Latin gave him a clean option. The word latus means side, flank, the side of a body or a building. It is the obvious equivalent. It carries the same range as the Hebrew. He did not use it. What he wrote was tulit unam de costis eius. He took one of his ribs. Costa is not ambiguous. It is not a word that might mean side in the right context. In Latin, it is the curved bone in the chest, and that is essentially all it is. In a single word choice, 1,000 years of interpretive flexibility was closed off, and it was closed off by a man who had the alternative sitting right there in his own vocabulary. Why he did it is a genuinely open question. He may have been following the interpretive consensus he had inherited from the Greek Church Fathers, who had generally read the Greek pleura anatomically. He may have found the concrete image more vivid. He may simply have made a call and moved on, the way translators make thousands of calls and move on. Jerome left us an enormous quantity of correspondence and commentary, and as far as I can tell, he never explains this one. The decision seemed small at the time. It was not. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. This channel goes back into the Hebrew and Greek behind familiar verses every week, and there are more of these than you would believe. So, one scholar, one word, one afternoon of work in a stone cell in Bethlehem. What happened to that choice over the following 1,000 years is what turned it from a translator's preference into something people believed about their own skeletons, because the Vulgate did not stay one translation among several. It became the Bible of Western Christianity for the next 1,100 years. It was the text read in every monastery, quoted in every sermon, copied in every scriptorium, cited in every theological argument from Augustine to Aquinas. If you lived in Europe between the 5th century and the 16th, and you encountered Genesis at all, you encountered it through Jerome. And then the vernacular translations started, and they inherited the problem. John Wycliffe's circle produced the first complete English Bible in the 1380s. They translated from the Vulgate, because that was the Bible they had, so of course they wrote rib. That much is unsurprising. What is more surprising is what happened next. William Tyndale published his English Pentateuch in 1530, and Tyndale, unlike Wycliffe, worked from the Hebrew. He was a serious Hebraist at a time when that was rare and dangerous. He was looking at the same word Jerome looked at, in the same language. with the same evidence available. He wrote rib. Then came the Geneva Bible in 1560, which said rib as well. The Bishop's Bible in 1568 did the same. And then, in 1611, 47 of the finest Hebrew and Greek scholars in England, working in 6 committees over 7 years, produced the King James Version. Rib. I want to be fair to all of them, because this is not a story about incompetence. Translation committees do not start from a blank page. They start from the version their readers already know, and they change it only when they have a compelling reason to. The instruction given to the King James translators was explicitly to follow the Bishop's Bible wherever they reasonably could. Nobody sat down in 1611 and independently concluded that Tsela meant rib. They inherited a reading that was already 1200 years old and left it alone. You would think that somewhere along that chain someone would have said something. As far as the printed record goes, nobody did, at least not loudly enough to change anything. And once it was in the King James Version, it was locked. That translation shaped English-speaking Christianity for 4 centuries. It shaped the language itself. Modern versions have quietly softened things, and several now carry a footnote offering side as an alternative, but the word in the body of the text has almost never changed, because at this point, changing it would feel like editing scripture rather than translating it. And it did something else, something almost nobody noticed for 400 years. It quietly cut Genesis chapter 2 loose from a scene in the Gospel of John that the early church had considered inseparable from it. We are coming back to that, and it is the reason I wanted to make this video. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange, and this is the part I find hardest to explain. Go and look at how medieval and Renaissance artists actually painted this scene. Not the modern illustrations, the old ones. The carvings on the west front of cathedrals, the illuminated manuscripts, the frescoes. Over and over again, they show a full-grown woman rising out of the man's side. No bone being extracted, no fragment, just a complete person emerging from his flank, usually while he lies asleep in a posture that looks less like surgery and more like a vision. Michelangelo painted it that way on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Eve steps out of Adam's side already whole, with no bone anywhere in the picture. Those artists were reading the Vulgate. They were reading costis, rib, and they painted side anyway because the older reading never fully died. It survived in the visual tradition of the church even as it disappeared from the text of the church, which is a peculiar thing for an idea to do. But the rib reading did not just change a picture, it changed an argument, and the argument it changed had consequences that ran for centuries in medicine, in law, and in how half the human race was told to understand itself. In 1543, a Flemish anatomist named Andreas Vesalius published a book that broke medicine open. It was called On the Fabric of the Human Body, and it was based on something almost nobody in European medicine had bothered to do properly for over 1,000 years, which was actually cutting bodies open and looking inside them rather than repeating what Galen had written in the 2nd century. Somewhere in that work, Vesalius noted a fact that should have been unremarkable. Men and women have the same number of ribs, 12 pairs in both cases. It was not received as unremarkable. It cut against something a great many educated Europeans believed as a matter of common knowledge, which was that men carried 1 rib fewer because of Genesis. Vesalius was not the first to point it out, and he was careful about how he framed it, but the fact that it needed pointing out at all tells you how thoroughly a translation choice had settled into people's picture of the physical world. And the belief did not die in the 16th century. Ask around today, and you will still find plenty of people, including people who have never opened a Bible in their lives, who are fairly sure men are a rib short. That is what a translation choice can do. It can generate a false anatomical belief that outlives the Roman Empire, but the anatomy is the small consequence. The larger one is what happened when the rib reading got combined with a second mistranslation 2 verses earlier, and this is the one I think is genuinely worth being annoyed about. Genesis 2 verse 18. The Lord God says, "It is not good for the human to be alone. I will make him an ezer kenegdo." The King James renders that as an helpmeet for him, and in 1611, meet was a perfectly ordinary English adjective meaning fitting or suitable, and help meet for him meant a helper suitable for him. Then English moved on. Meet fell out of use in that sense, and readers started hearing the two words as one, helpmeet, which then softened further into helpmate. And by the 19th century, helpmate was a standard English noun meaning a wife, with a distinct flavor of assistant, of junior partner, of the person who supports the person doing the actual work. That word does not exist in the Hebrew. It is a translation artifact that grew a life of its own. So what does the Hebrew actually say? Ezer means help or aid or rescue. It appears roughly 20 times across the Hebrew Bible. And here is what makes it interesting. The overwhelming majority of those occurrences do not describe a subordinate at all. They describe God. Deuteronomy 33. There is none like the God of Jeshurun, who rides the heavens to your Ezer. Psalm 33. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our Ezer and our shield. Psalm 121, the one everybody knows. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my Ezer come? My Ezer comes from the Lord. Psalm 124. Our Ezer is in the name of the Lord. Moses even names one of his sons Eliezer, which means my God is my Ezer. When Ezer is not describing God, it usually describes a military ally, a nation you call on when you are outmatched. Isaiah uses it that way. Ezekiel uses it that way. There is no occurrence anywhere in the Hebrew Bible where the word implies that the helper is lesser than the one being helped. Not one. It is a word about strength arriving from outside yourself at a moment when you need it. And then kenegdo, which is the part that really matters. It comes from neged, meaning in front of, opposite, facing. The suffix makes it his. So, the phrase means something like a strength corresponding to him, or a counterpart standing opposite him, or facing him as his equal and match. Put it back together honestly, and Genesis 2:18 reads closer to this. It is not good for the human to be in separateness. I will make a corresponding strength, a counterpart facing him, which you will notice sounds a great deal like the description of something being divided in two, and nothing at all like the description of an assistant being manufactured. Now stack the two readings on top of each other and look at what English-speaking Christianity inherited. A woman made from a spare bone, described as a helpmate, derivative in substance, subordinate in function. Neither of those ideas is actually in the Hebrew, and both of them are firmly in the English. Now, before anybody starts typing in the comments, I know this is the point where the video stops being about Hebrew grammar and starts being about something people have fought over for 20 centuries, so let me be careful with it. The argument that the order of creation carries some weight goes back a great deal further than medieval translators. It is already sitting in the New Testament. Paul makes a version of it in the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and the writer of 1 Timothy makes a version of it in chapter 2. Christians have been arguing about the scope and application of those passages for 2,000 years, and they are still arguing about them energetically right now. That argument is much bigger than a word study, and I am not going to pretend a Hebrew lexicon settles it. What I will point out is the strangest thing about that entire tradition, which is what the commentators themselves kept doing without seeming to notice. They kept drifting back to the word side, even while their Bibles said rib. Matthew Henry, writing his commentary in the early 1700s and reading the King James Version, produced the line that has probably been quoted at more weddings than any other sentence in Christian commentary. She was not made out of his head to rule over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled upon by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected, and near his heart to be beloved. Out of his side. He had rib on the page in front of him, and he wrote side anyway, because the sense of the passage kept pulling him there. Versions of that same formula show up in medieval writers centuries earlier. The instinct never went away. Now I owe you the other side of this, because if I only give you the argument I find persuasive, I am doing the same thing I have spent 40 minutes complaining about. There is a real case for rib, and it rests on three things. First, and this is the strongest one, the Hebrew says achat mitzalotav, one from his tselaot. That is a partitive construction with a plural. It implies selecting one item out of a set of several. A human body has two sides, and saying one of his two sides is grammatically fine but slightly odd. A rib cage, on the other hand, has a lot of ribs, and one of them is exactly the kind of thing you take one of. Second, the verse continues, and he closed up the flesh in its place. The word there suggests a specific spot being sealed, which reads more naturally as a cavity left by removal than as the seam of a division. Third, the anatomical reading is genuinely ancient. It is not a Latin invention. Josephus, writing in Greek in the 1st century, roughly 400 years before Jerome, straightforwardly says God took out one of Adam's ribs. So the anatomical understanding was already circulating among Jewish writers well before the Vulgate existed. Those are real arguments, and they deserve to be on the table. The honest position, the one I actually hold, is that the Hebrew is ambiguous and has been ambiguous since the day it was written, that both readings have ancient support, and that the architectural sense of the word has the weight of 40 other verses behind it, while the anatomical sense has one. Nobody in that chain picked the wrong option. What went wrong is that after Jerome, English readers stopped being able to see that an option had been picked at all. And there is one last piece of evidence, one that has nothing to do with Hebrew or Latin or Greek. It comes from a clay tablet, it is older than Genesis, and it involves a goddess whose name means Lady of the Rib. The tablet comes from Nippur, in what is now southern Iraq, and the story on it is Sumerian, which makes it older than Hebrew as a written language. Scholars call it Enki and Ninhursag. The copies we have date to the early 2nd millennium before Christ, and the material behind them is older still. It is set in a place called Dilmun, described as pure, clean and bright, a land where nothing dies and nothing hurts. If that already sounds familiar, keep going, because it gets stranger. Enki, the god of fresh water and cunning, eats 8 plants he was not supposed to eat. The goddess Ninhursag curses him for it, and he begins to die, sickening in 8 parts of his body, one for each plant. Eventually she is persuaded to relent, and she sets about healing him. She asks him, one at a time, which part hurts. For each answer, she brings a healing deity into existence. 7 of those 8 healings are footnotes. The 8th is the reason this tablet keeps surfacing in arguments about Genesis. One of the 8 parts he names is his rib. The Sumerian word for rib is ti, and the goddess she creates to heal it is called Ninti. Nin means lady, so Ninti is the lady of the rib, except that in Sumerian ti carries a second meaning. It also means to live, or to make live, which means Ninti is simultaneously and unavoidably the lady who makes live. One name, 2 meanings, rib and life, fused together in a single syllable, because that is how the Sumerian language happens to work. Now go back to Genesis. The woman built from the Tsela is given a name in chapter 3, verse 20, Hava, and the text pauses to explain the name, which it rarely does. She is called Hava because she is the mother of all living, rib and life, attached to the same woman, in two texts separated by 1,000 miles and a great many centuries. The scholar who made this argument famous was Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his career reading Sumerian tablets and was probably the most significant summerologist of the 20th century. His observation was elegant. The double meaning is a natural pun in Sumerian. In Hebrew it is not a pun at all, because Tsela and Hava have no phonetic relationship whatsoever. The wordplay does not work, which sounds like it should sink the theory. Kramer argued it does the exact opposite. And that, Kramer suggested, is exactly what you would expect from a motif that traveled. The literary association survives the journey. The pun that generated it does not, because puns never survive translation. What you are left with is a strange pairing that looks arbitrary in the receiving language and obvious in the original. I should be straight with you about how contested this is. Plenty of Assyriologists and biblical scholars are unconvinced, and they have decent reasons. The Sumerian text is not a creation account. Enki is a god being cured of indigestion, not a human being divided in two. Ninti is one of 8 healing deities, and the story does not treat her as special. And the etymology of Hava is itself disputed, with some scholars connecting it to a root meaning to live, and others proposing an older Semitic word connected to serpents. So this is a proposal, not a finding. I find it suggestive rather than convincing, and I would rather tell you that than oversell it. But sit with the irony for a second, because it is a good one. If Kramer is right, then the rib reading, the one that has no support anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, might actually be a faint echo of something genuinely ancient, older than Genesis, older than Hebrew, preserved by accident in the very translation that flattened the Hebrew word. Jerome may have written down a memory nobody had access to for another 1400 years. Which brings us to the last thing, and this is the one that made me want to make this video in the first place. Remember the Septuagint? Those Alexandrian translators working around 250 years before Christ rendered the Hebrew Tsela into Greek as pleura. It is the ordinary Greek word for side or flank, the same root that gives English the pleura around the lungs. Now open the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 34. Jesus has just died on the cross. The Roman soldiers come to break the legs of the crucified men to hasten death, and they find he is already gone. So instead, one soldier takes a spear and pierces his side, and immediately blood and water come out. The Greek word John uses for side is pleura. The same word, not a similar word, not a related word. The identical noun the Septuagint used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 21. Any Greek-speaking Christian in the first 4 centuries would have heard that instantly, because they were reading both texts in the same language, and the Church Fathers absolutely did hear it. Augustine writes about it directly. The first Adam sleeps, and from his opened side his bride is brought forth. The second Adam sleeps the sleep of death on the cross, and from his opened side come blood and water. And from those, the church, his bride, is born. John Chrysostom preached the same connection. It became one of the standard typological readings of the early church, and it is carved into baptisteries and painted onto altarpieces all over Europe. Paul had already set the frame in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, where he calls Christ the last Adam. And now notice what the parallel requires. It requires a side. The entire typology collapses the moment you make it a rib, because nothing in the crucifixion scene involves a rib. No one has ever suggested that a Roman spear extracted a bone. The comparison only works because both scenes describe an opening made in the side of a sleeping man and something coming out of it that becomes a bride. It requires a sleep that is not ordinary unconsciousness, which is precisely what Tardemah is everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, and precisely what those same Alexandrian translators signaled when they reached for ekstasis instead of a word for sleep. In Greek, the two verses are welded together by vocabulary. You cannot read them side by side and miss it. In English, one of them says rib and the other says side, and the weld is invisible. 1400 years of English-speaking Christians have read both passages, many of them hundreds of times, and never once seen that the Bible was pointing back at itself. So go back to where we started, the cathedral ceiling, the carved stone above the door, the image everybody carries around of a man asleep on the ground, and a small white bone being lifted out of his chest. The Hebrew word meant the side of a structure, the same word it uses for the flank of the ark, the wall of the tabernacle, the chambers of the temple, and the slope of a hill. The verb belonged to construction, the one used for houses and city walls. The sleep was the trance that fell on Abraham the night he was shown the future. And the first thing the man said when he woke was an oath of belonging, the same oath the tribes of Israel swore to David on the day they made him king. None of that is hidden. It is sitting in the text in plain sight, in the original language, available to anyone willing to look up 40 verses. It just did not survive the trip into Latin. If you want the next piece of this, there is a word in Genesis chapter 3 that reshaped how the church understood marriage, and it is mistranslated worse than this one. Watch it, and you will never read that chapter the same way again. It is on screen now.